Good evening and welcome to Kentucky Humanities Facebook Live discussion of Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. I'm Bill Goodman, along with Dr. Jessica Chiquetto Heineman, an English professor at Northern Kentucky University in the Creative Writing Department, and also a writer in her own right, who's publishing a memoir that will be out next year by Norton Press, and that's entitled Sounds Like a Titanic. Jessica, welcome to our Facebook Live discussion.
Thank you, Bill. It's so great to be here.
And I think I'd like to start and let you tell everyone in our listening and viewing audience tonight that we'll get into the details of chapters 4, 5, and 6 of All the King's Men. But you've told me that this novel and Robert Penn Warren had an influence over your memoir. So tell me about that.
Yeah, that's true. I first read this book at 17, like so many people do, in high school for an English class. And it immediately became one of those books that grabbed me as a young person in high school. And later, when I was on a violin tour that would later become the subject for my book, in order to comfort myself, because I was having a hard time on that tour, I picked up this book and read it while I toured around America. And then later, as I was writing my book about the violin tour, I reread the book again, this time as part of my PhD, in writing the memoir. And then this time is my fourth time reading it. And every single time has been a different experience. And my thoughts about the book have evolved, and they've become part of my own work as well. I use an epigraph, the epigraph to my own book as a quote from this book, and I quote from this book in my book. So I feel a strong affinity with the novel.
I think that's going to make for a fascinating conversation with you tonight. You've told me that chapter 4, which we're going to begin with in just a few minutes, is one of your favorites, and you've learned something from reading chapter 4, and we'll explain all this if you haven't read along with us this summer. We hope you have. If you haven't, there's still plenty of time to do that. But before we get into this discussion, I want to remind everybody that this Kentucky Reads event is part of our year-long project of Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. There are a number of events that are still coming up all across the state of Kentucky. There are 5 community discussions in Lexington, Louisville, Northern Kentucky, at the Northern Kentucky University, Paducah, and Bowling Green, which all the community members can attend absolutely free. There's an activity before a community discussion about All the King's Men at each of these locations. We are involved in a Kentucky educational television documentary by the very noted documentarian Tom Thurman, who's doing a documentary on Robert Penn Warren for the very first time, a documentary about his life. There will be a play, so we're all really excited about the many activities, including our Facebook Live discussions like this one that we're having tonight. And then next month, we'll tell you a little bit more about that one coming up with Jonathan Cullick and who he is and what he's done for Kentucky Humanities and for Northern Kentucky University and the University Press of Kentucky. But that'll be a little bit later. But there are a lot of activities. kyhumanities.org is our website, and it would be best if you just went to that and took a look at it. So tonight, last month with Richard Taylor, former Port Laureate and Transylvania University professor, we discussed in depth chapters 1, 2, and 3, and tonight with Jessica, 4, 5, and 6. And again, before we get into the details of the chapter, Jessica, why do you think this novel is still celebrated as one of the greatest novels of all time?
Well, I think there's several reasons for that. One is that I think it speaks to something about American politics. So this kind of goes beyond people who are English professors, people who love reading, and maybe to people who love politics and who are interested in American history and the way in which politics works in America. So beyond the writing itself, which we're going to get into some magnificent writing, but I think it speaks to something that is very true then and now about the American political system. So that's one reason I think it endures. The other reason is that I think a lot of us, those of us who encountered this book first in high school, there's something about Jack Burton as a narrator that I think resonates often with young people who are seeking answers to, questions both big and small. Big questions. What is history? what is time and where's my place in history? Small questions. How does a Democratic Party work? How do local politics work? So those things I think are appealing at a young age, at an older age, throughout. So that's why I think it appeals to people still.
So for those who have been reading along with us, and maybe for those who are just beginning to read the book, give us a just very brief summation of where we are with chapters 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to begin again, as I said, with chapter 4. But if you would just give us a brief outline and the main characters.
Sure, absolutely. So first, congratulations to those who have gotten. It's a long book. It can be a hard book. It's a book that tells us how to read it. We don't tell it how to read it. It tells us how fast we're going to read it, and it's often a slow but rewarding read. So,
but don't you think it grows on the reader as you go along? If you struggle somewhat with 1, 2, and 3, it really picks up at this point, I think, and just becomes so fascinating.
I agree. So if you have not quite gotten to the end of chapter 3 yet, or if it's been a while since you've read those chapters, one important thing to remember is that all of these chapters are narrated from the standpoint of 1939, from Jack Burton's standpoint in 1939. It starts with a trip to Mason City, where Jack, and this we go back to 1936, where Jack is going with Willie to Mason City. Willie gives his first non-speech that we see in the book. We have the staged photograph, right, in front of Willie's family home, where Jack is tasked with getting the dog up on the porch. And then that chapter ends with a nighttime trip to Judge Irwin's house. And so that's chapter 1. Moving into chapter 2, also narrated from 1939, this time we jump all the way back to 1922. Where Jack is a newspaper reporter. I'm sorry, I think I said in the first chapter he's actually, by that point in 1936, working for Willy. Back in 1922...
The governor.
Yes, Willie Stark, the governor, and some of you may have Willie Talos, depending on your edition. Back in 1922, Jack is a newspaper reporter for the Chronicle. Willie Stark is just a simple county treasurer. The head of the city council that Willie is working with is awarded a contract to build a new school, and the contract is given to a high bidder, right? And under the various circumstances. And one important thing to think about tonight is back to that moment in terms of the racial politics that lead to that unscrupulous bid that goes on, because that's going to be really important as we get into chapter 4. And thinking about in the ways in which racism is a means by which corruption prevails in politics. Willie's trounced in his next treasurer election, and he starts studying law at night. He sets up a law practice. And then one day, during a fire drill, the fire escape of the school collapses, children are killed, and suddenly Willie is this local hero that everyone admires. He is then set up in a setup of state politics in which one candidate decides to split the vote of the other candidate by using Willie, who is seen to appeal to the rural vote. So Willie goes out and starts giving speeches around the countryside, and they are horrible. He is into making policy speeches that no one's particularly interested in hearing. At some point, during all of this, Jack is a newspaper reporter who's hearing Willie pace back and forth in his hotel room giving these speeches. Jack gives Willie some advice on how to make those speeches better, which you talked a lot about last time. And that's a really important moment, too, as we go forward into the novel, because that is a moment where Jack is actually making Willie into the politician that he later becomes. So the questions of Jack's role in history and his guilt over things that happen subsequently, that moment we'll be coming back to that. Later, Willie finds out through Sadie Burke that, in fact, he has been set up and that he was never meant to run the governorship, and he ends up drinking a lot and going to the fair the next day with a horrible hangover where he gives his first true speech, in which he talks about
Threw away his prepared remarks and
Absolutely.
spoke off the cuff, if you will,
Yes.
and said that he was looked out to them and said, "You're a hick just like me. I'm a hick too." And,
yes,
and that sort of began his, I guess, natural attraction to the common folk.
absolutely. And Sadie Burke is, of course, watching during this,
And she is a campaign aide
yes,
who plays rather a key role throughout. Although she disappears in many sections of the novel, she comes back and makes grand entrances at very key times in the novel. But we'll get to that later too.
And Sadie Burke is the one for the eye, for the political gift, the political genius. She's the one who sees Willie giving that speech and thinks this could be a great politician. But first, Willie does not run for governor. He says he's going to stop for McMurphy, and he does, and McMurphy wins. And Willie goes back to practicing law, where he makes lots and lots of money practicing law. And Jack Burton, our narrator, actually doesn't encounter Willie for years, during those years, until Willie runs for governor again. And then we get a series of events in which Jack is forced to leave his job, his newspaper job, because the newspaper wants him to write against Willie, and Jack actually quite sympathizes with some of the policies that Willie is espousing. Jack quits his job and enters a depression. But then one morning, Sadie Burke calls Jack and says, come work for the boss, and Jack agrees to do that. So that brings us up to chapter 3.
And that is, I think, when you said that Jack entered some depression, had some problems. That was the first great sleep, and
Yes.
we'll talk about that as we go through. That's not a common phrase that you hear. In fact, it's Robert Penn Warren's phrase for the state of mind that Jack found himself in. But he has. He's been a student. He's attempted to go to graduate school and work on a PhD, and he's done some work there. And so in chapter 4, it begins with Jack Burton saying, "It was to be my second excursion into the past, more interesting and sensational than the first." And by the way, this is on the page 236 of the edition that we're using, not the revised edition. And he goes on to say, but the first one had not been successful, Jack says. It had not been successful because in the midst of the process, I tried to discover the truth or not the facts. Then, when the truth was not to be discovered, or discovered could not be understood by me, I could not bear to live with the cold-eyed reproach of the facts. And again, this is this magic language that Robert Penn Warren, letting you sort of see Jack Burton unfold. And this is where we understand that Jack is going back and in grad school had done some work on his own history and discovers a gentleman by the name of
Cass Mastern. And so we get to the Cass Mastern chapter, one of the most complex and misunderstood and maybe not debated, not the most inviting chapter the first time. I have to say, the first time I read this when I was 17, this was the chapter I kind of skimmed. I didn't skim because I love the book, but I didn't understand and I wanted to get back to the main action. And I think that would be, that's probably a really common feeling the first time you read this book is, what is going on? What does this have to do with anything? What's funny is that now, 4 reads through later, this is my favorite chapter of the entire book, and I think it's the most important chapter in a lot of ways. A lot of reasons. One, we get to the heart of, I think, it's a story within a story, right? And we get to something that I think in the rest of the book is kind of beaten around with this kind of original sin of America, which is slavery. And this, we look at individual betrayals between people, and then we look at larger betrayals, the betrayal of the Confederacy to the Union. We look at the betrayal of, really the ultimate betrayal of human beings is slavery, right? Not being able to see another person's humanity is an ultimate betrayal. So I think in that way it actually gets to some political issues that otherwise are not really touched on in the book in that way.
It's been said that the chapter 4 with Kass Mastern is not essential or relevant to the plot of the novel, but to the theme of the novel.
Yes.
How do you explain that?
Yeah. It absolutely has nothing to do with the plot. You could skip chapter 4, right, pretty much, and be able to follow the events of Willie Stark and Jack Burton and the rest of the main characters of the book without reading this. And in fact, one interesting thing to know is that this chapter was actually originally published as a separate piece by Robert Penn Warren before the novel itself was published. So it's possible Robert Penn Warren saw it as its own entity, but it obviously deals with issues that he was very much thinking about and wanted to incorporate into the book. But yeah, in terms of the themes, so the themes, because I think that's the big question, and I think this is what
this is what Jonathan, yes. And let's be honest with everyone in the audience. This is Jonathan Cullick, who is the also at Northern Kentucky University, the author of more than just one Robert Penn Warren book. Also, his book, All the King's Men: A Reader's Companion, is available now in bookstores and from the University Press of Kentucky. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Jonathan will join me next month for the concluding chapters of All the King's Men. But Jonathan does add into our discussion tonight, Jessica, lots of readers, especially students, maybe at 17, 18, 19 years old, get frustrated with the Kass Mastern chapter. What's the point of it, they might ask. Suggestions for helping readers understand this chapter. So you can now tell Jonathan how to understand this chapter.
Right, after reading Jonathan's book to help understand it myself. Well, I think you can approach this question in a variety of different ways. I mean, first, what's really interesting is William Faulkner said that this was his most favorite part of the book as well, and that might have been a backhanded compliment because it's so different from the rest of the book. But I think you can't read this without thinking of Faulkner's infamous quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." The idea of having to delve into the past in order to understand one's present, I think, is something that, of course, we know that as historians, but often people lose sight of that. My specialty is not Robert Penn Warren. My specialty is memoir writing. And in my classes where students learn how to write about their own lives, we delve back into the past. And at first they write a first draft and it seems like, oh, well, it's a simple story. But then as the second and third and fourth draft comes out, the story can completely change. And it's not because they were making something up or it wasn't true the first time. It's just the more that you dig into the past, the more complicated, the more complex it becomes. And so there are many things we could talk about in terms of why this chapter is important to young people. But one is the importance of understanding not only the historical past, but your own past in order to understand your place in history.
So maybe another way to answer the question that many have and that Jonathan Cullick raised was that Robert Penn Warren was very intentional. He used this as a vehicle to tell more of the story that is revealed later of Jack Burton. It wasn't just a separate story, a history story that was somehow just plopped down in the middle of this novel about Willie Stark and Jack Burton and politics and demagoguery and rural journalism. It is used as a vehicle to do what for Jack Burton? What happens to Jack Burton through the understanding of the Kass Mastern story that helps him grow? Does he understand? Is it used? You talked about the slavery that is so well spelled out. What happened? Let's just ask it like this: what happened to Kass Mastern in the slavery movement that he was involved in? What is part of that in chapter 4?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot to talk about here. First, in terms of Jack Burton, of course, by the end of chapter 4, the whole point is he can't finish his dissertation about Kass Mastern because he doesn't understand the Kass Mastern. He says he understands Gilbert Mastering. Jack Burton understands Gilbert Mastering. This is a bull-headed man who is a quintessential American businessman. He starts from nothing, builds his way up, kind of bulldozes everything in his way. But, Kass Mastering, though, is more the romantic, the person who is acting out of more subtle sort of impulses in his life. And Jack Burton says he can't understand Kass Mastering, so this is why the first delve into history was unsuccessful, because Jack Burton doesn't know Jack Burton. This is where it's important to remind everyone again that the whole novel is being narrated from a future tense Jack Burton in 1939. He's talking about himself in the early 1920s writing this dissertation, and that 1920s Jack Burton could not understand Kass Mastering. And I don't want to give anything away by jumping in into, eventually Jack Burton will have, the 1939 Jack Burton that you will get to in later chapters, will have an epiphany about Kass Mastering and how it fits into this. But I think it's safe to say, even if you haven't gotten past chapters 4 to 6, that Jack is deeply conflicted about what his role is in terms of the Stark administration, right? About how one day you're just randomly at a cafe and one guy walks in and suddenly the entire fate of a state, and maybe a nation, if he had gone on to the U.S. Senate, is determined by random circumstances and your own actions. He's extremely interested in, well, what is my responsibility and what is not my responsibility? And that's another thing that I think is really important if you're teaching this chapter to younger readers, and it often weighs really heavily on younger readers. To what extent am I responsible for the sins of the world? To what extent is that not my purview, right? And you see Jack struggling with that with Willy throughout the book, and of course the idea of Kass Mastering, both in his personal life, in the betrayal of his friend, but also in the wider story here that's being told about the betrayal of slavery, right? Of the individual betrayal of Phoebe, but also the wider betrayal of human being against human being.
So, Dr. Hunman, if this was written as a vehicle for the reader to better understand Jack in the present, when he is putting together his grad student work, his PhD work, if it was used by Warren at that time, does it in any way give the reader an understanding of what Warren's Southern upbringing and relationship to blacks at that time, and what he was thinking when he wrote the novel?
Yeah, well, I think in literature classes we're always careful to never ascribe the narrator to the author, but we can look at what the narrator is, kind of how the narrator is describing this, and then of course we can read about Warren and what his worldviews are. And I think it's important to separate those out, because Jack Burton is in a sense a character. However, at the same time, Jack Burton, the character, and this will be probably a question better asked to Dr. Kullick, who's going to know this better, but Jack Burton, the character, as far as I can tell from the biographical details of Robert Penn Warren, is not radically different from Robert Penn Warren. In the details, we're talking about agrarian Southern ex-slave owning families, right, of the Southern aristocracy, right? Warren was extremely, I think, interested in the question of how, what his role was in that, in navigating civil rights, right? So in this chapter, we're talking about the Civil War. Robert Penn Warren himself wrote about Jim Crow. He has a really interesting article for anyone who's interested in this. Read the interview that Robert Penn Warren gives to Malcolm X. What's interesting about it is that Robert Penn Warren is primarily interested in whether white people can escape guilt for the ills inflicted on black people. And Malcolm X recently asks him, but can black children escape racism? Robert Penn Warren is asking, how can you blame a 4-year-old white kid for the ills of racism and slavery? And Malcolm X turns that question around and asks, but can you protect a 4-year-old black child from the ills of racism, right? So this problematizes a reading of Robert Penn Warren, because I think he was very much interested in kind of his own guilt or his own uncomfortableness And that sometimes is a limitation in the novel,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
We want to encourage all of you who've been reading along with us or are just beginning to read the novel this summer to, if you have a question for Dr. Hyndman tonight, please ask that on Facebook. We would love to answer that. If you have an observation that you'd like to make about the novel, we'd also appreciate you sending us just your observation. Doesn't have to be a question. So please just put those on Facebook, and we'll get those through the hour that we have. So to leave this for a moment, but without saying that even though there might be a debate among professors and scholars about the narrator, in this case Jack Burton, putting Warren putting himself in that place, is it you think it's debatable that there's any sort of justification that Warren himself was looking at slavery, examining the moral implications of what happened in this country that was so horrible, that went on for so many years, and in a way to reveal through Jack that this occurred and that there's a lesson learned, and of course we find out a little bit more later that we don't want to. We'll do a spoiler alert if we have to do that. So that can be a part of it too.
Yes.
So let me just ask you to go on and talk a little bit more about chapter 4. We mentioned the great sleep a few minutes ago, and what happens through that. But I also want to ask you if you'll comment on that. But at one point, Warren indicates that Jack is ready to step into this awful responsibility of time, capitalized time, T-I-M-E. What do you think he was saying there about the timeliness of the novel we talked about? Is that the same kind of responsibility of time, the awful responsibility of time?
Yeah, well, if we think about Jack Burton, and even his name, Burden, he's burdened by history, right? And I think that's very much what this chapter is about the burden of history. And in terms of, that idea of the awful responsibility of time, I mean, you can even think of this book. I don't know if anybody's noticed the epigraph. It's from Dante's Purgatory, Purgatorio, which is the second part of the Divine Comedy. The first is Inferno, hell. The second is Purgatory, which is where epigraph comes. And the third is Paradiso, or heaven. And the epigraph translates into, as long as hope has its bit of green. And we can think about Jack Burton being in a sort of purgatory throughout most of this novel, wherein he can't really make a decision one way or another about how to live his life. Right? This is one of Anne Stanton's main criticisms of him, is that he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life, and she sees him as, she doesn't care if they're going to be poor. She doesn't care what profession he chooses, but he needs to choose. And instead of choosing, he becomes obsessed with the past. And if he's in purgatory for most of the novel, but here we go back into the 1850s, I think we could argue that in a certain sense, this chapter is like going back to hell. This is going through the circles of hell until, if you know Dante's Inferno, at the very last circle is the one for traitors. And we get back to how this is a chapter all about betrayal. Friend betraying friend, the Annabelle betraying Phoebe, the Confederacy betraying the Union, and then slavery as a betrayal of human dignity, right? And so in all of those ways, we're taken back to these kind of original sins. And that Dante was obsessed with sin, and in a certain way, Jack wouldn't put it as sin, but he's obsessed with choice and responsibility, which in a certain sense, if you look at all the punishments that Dante is going through, what we're asking about is, well, who's responsible for what action? What sin goes with what punishment? And that's what this book is concerned with as well. And the chapters
that's such an excellent interpretation, and I appreciate that. I know our listeners and viewers did too. To really that really clarifies a lot, because I think you're putting yourself into Warren's mind about what he possibly was was trying to say,
Yeah.
and that was beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you. And as a writer, epigraphs are just always,
Sort
we
of
always pay attention. What
a
is
good
the writer?
crutch.
Yeah. Or what?
Yeah.
Because obviously he was influenced. If you put that first.
So Amanda writes in and makes a comment and says that she sees similarities between Kass Mastern, and Adam. Adam, the brother of Anne, the son of former Governor Stanton, who you find out in this chapter. You've already been given a hint, but in 5 and 6, you find out that Adam really begins to play a more key role in that Governor Stark wants him to become the director of the hospital that Governor Stark is building, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But she says she sees that tie between Kass and Adam, their romantic view of doing good. Yeah.
I think that's really smart. And I think it's insightful because both of them somewhat look to art. Adam and his music. He's banging the piano. He escapes from the hard days of surgery by banging on the piano, and Kass to literature, right? To kind of escape from the world in some sense. And of course, what this chapter shows us is that even being a student of history, a student of literature, is not a 100% effective antidote to repeating the past, right? So I think at one point there's this line about how Jefferson Davis also read the Aeneid or studied Greek tragedy. So that just because you are versed in the classics doesn't mean that you're going to make the right decisions or be able to somehow escape the past. But these are two people who I think are very much interested in escape in one way or another.
Charles asks, is Willie Stark, Governor Stark, the kind of politician who can appear in any generation?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, of course, and there are many examples that you can cite.
Right.
You have to read between Charles's lines here to say, and not just in present day.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are many examples throughout the decades, throughout the presidency, or politicians. It doesn't have to be presidents.
You know what's so interesting about this is that when I was 17 and reading this book, the political implications of, I wasn't so deft at reading into this is a Democratic policy, this is a Republican policy. I had no idea at 17 which party this was supposed to be. Now there's a definite, the kind of free healthcare for all, free education that he's promising comes across as a more left platform, but I don't think that was even something I picked up on the first time I read it. And I think what's universal about this is the idea of someone who's idealistic, who has come from modest means, who wants to change the world for good, but in that process becomes corrupted and is either not effective or limited in their effectiveness in actually affecting change, or perhaps even affects change in a negative way in the world. And that is something, regardless of party or time, that I think, or generation, that transcends that, something we can find ourselves in.
And I asked you a minute ago to talk about the Great Sleep. Again, Warren uses capitalization for the Great Sleep, and what that is and why that becomes sort of an effective metaphor throughout the novel.
Well, I would just love to hear from readers what you think about his capitalization in general, of the characters. There are just some really great capitalizations, and it was in a technique that I've always admired of his, and I've used a little bit of, inspired me to do a little bit in my own book. So one, the capital letters are interesting, and two, just this idea of the Great Sleep. I think today, I don't even know if it's called depression in the book. Today we would call something like this, if you're sleeping for months on end, depression is what that is. What's interesting is the timing, right? In all cases, something that Jack Burton has wanted to work out, either his newspaper job, I don't want to give too much away, but his marriage is another time, his first marriage is another time where he goes into the Great Sleep. And I believe he goes into a third Great Sleep at the end, but I want to talk too much to give too much away. So at what points can he not face the present, and therefore just has to go to sleep?
I want to talk a little bit about language, which you know a lot about, and I want to refer to And again, page 236 in my edition, where the paragraph begins, long ago, Jack Burton was a graduate student. Now, we're in the middle. It goes back to the beginning of chapter 4, and Jack is speaking in first person when he talks about my second excursion.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, without hardly a turn, in the third paragraph, Warren begins to write saying, long ago, Jack Burton was a graduate student working for his PhD in American history. Mm-hmm. Now, it immediately jumps to third person.
Yeah.
Now, we all know writers, and you can probably cite many more than I can, of changing the way you might approach first person, second person, and third person. Mm-hmm. Why do you think in this case it worked so well when Warren did it in sort of the beginning, not even the middle of this chapter 4?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, one, if you want to read a brilliant analysis of the pronouns in this book, I recommend, again, Dr. Kulick's Guide to All the King's Men, because he gets into this in detail. But I think that this is Jack Burton's delve into history, which in doing so, he himself becomes a historical relic. So again, remember, he's writing in 1939, or the narrator is speaking in 1939 about an older version of Jack Burton who is looking to the history to try to, well, he thinks he's trying to just get a PhD and figure out his uncle, but what he ended up doing, 1939 Jack Burton knows, what 1922 Jack Burton actually did was figure out himself, right? And this is why we have these sorts of pursuits, whether we go into history or music or literature. We often may think it's just a passion. Oh, I really love history. I really love music. I love literature. But what we're often figuring out in that process is something about ourselves, something that we don't understand about ourselves, bad or good. And that seems to be what he's doing. And so he becomes a subject of his history within the history itself. It's a fantastic technique that I love.
Scott comments and says a lot of envy in Jack Burton, one of the 7 deadly sins.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And something Dante was interested in as well. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about language, and you may have some examples too. But there are countless numbers of. I guess I was struck more reading the second and third time of the use of his brilliant use of language. Simile seems to be one of those tools in the writer's toolbox that comes up quite often, and I think one of the best examples is when Warren is describing how, again, Cass sees the interconnectedness of events,
yes.
and that's on. Now I don't have the exact page number, but
I think I have it because I wanted to go over that too.
Well,
so I'm glad you did.
I think he said that the paragraph, and if you have that on the
188.
188, and this is your revised edition. Warren writes and explains. He learned that the world is like an enormous spider web, and if you touch it, however lightly at any point, the vibration ripples to the remotest perimeter, and the drowsy spider feels the tingle.
Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. And I'd be really interested in what people see in that and like why that resonates. To me, it's in, we talk a lot in writing class about verbs. Simple things, really. Verbs, action verbs. Look how many there are in that sentence. Ripples, feels the tingle, which is a noun in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Springs out to fling the gossamer, coils about you to have touched the web, right? It's just this action verb after action verb after action verb, which really gets to the idea of one small action produces, even on the sentence level, action verb, action verb, action verb, action verb. And you can even tell in the sentence, the syntax of the sentence, that it goes on and on and on and on. So it's almost like, even by beginning the sentence, you don't know where the sentence is going to end. It's almost echoing that idea that once you've touched the web of life, you really don't know where it's going to end.
So in the conclusion of chapter 4, when you read it the 4th time, what do you think Warren wanted people to come away with? Not the first read through as a 17-year-old, but the real essence of chapter 4 and the Cass story.
Yeah. So here's the essence for me. It's the the passage that begins on the top of 175, and I'll read a little bit of it, but just to point out some of the things he's doing technically here with the language. This is right after Duncan. Annabelle is, I mean, think about the complexity of the setup to this. It's Jack Burton narrating how younger Jack Burton was dissertating how Kass was being told by Annabelle about this thing that happened to her. So this is actually in the voice of Annabelle. I saw Phoebe remove the bolster and then look down at a spot where the bolster had lain on my side of the bed. She picked something up and came toward me. She stared at me, and her eyes, they are yellow. You look up to them and you can't see what is in them. She stared at me a long time, and then she held out her hand, clenched shut, and she watched me. And then so slow, she opened up the fingers, and there lay the ring on the palm of her hand. And I knew it was his ring, but all I thought was, it is gold, and it is lying in a gold hand. For Phoebe's hand was gold. I had never noticed how her hand was the color of gold. Then I looked up, and she was staring at me, and her eyes were gold too, bright and hard like gold, and I knew she knew. Knew, I echoed. This is now Kass speaking. Knew, I echoed, like a question, but I knew too. And I want you to notice is a repetition of no, but I knew too now. My friend had learned the truth from the coldness of his wife, from the gossip of the servants, had drawn the gold ring from his finger and carried it to the bed where he had laid down with her and put it beneath her pillow and had gone down and shot himself, but under circumstances that no one save his wife could ever guess it to be more than an accident. But he had made one fault of calculation. The yellow wench had found the ring. She knows, she whispers. Mm-hmm. And then if you just look throughout that paragraph, she knows. Mm-hmm. And part of what I think is so brilliant about this is it gets to this entire idea of this original sin. Who caused it? Kass did not create the institution of slavery, right? And yet his actions by sleeping with his friend's wife have now put into place a set of circumstances where this person who's completely innocent, who's already lived a horrible life, is now going to enter another almost circle of hell, right, of torture and rape, and her life is going to be horrible, all because of his actions that he didn't know where the web was going to lead. And that idea of that Annabelle cannot look at it, I think becomes a metaphor for how, in a certain sense, white people cannot look at this original sin, right? The not being able to look at her, that's repeated, not the eyes, not being able to look. And then the idea that Phoebe knows the crime, right? So that the person looking back at you knows your crimes, mm-hmm. right? And that you're unable to deal with that. That to me, and because it's right here in the center, almost like if you look at your book, mm-hmm. right in the center, that to me is the heart mm-hmm. of the entire kind of political mm-hmm.
story
of this nation, right? Mm-hmm. Is someone doing someone wrong and then not being able to look at them because they're so guilty, mm-hmm. right? We get so much of our common history and our politics and our problems spring from that dynamic.
Yeah. Well, that's again such an excellent summary and interpretation. That's quite beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another comment from Scott tonight. So many threats come at the reader. Excuse me, not threats. Yes, threats. I thought I misread that. Let me start again from Scott. So many threats come at the reader, from the highway at the beginning to the spider at the center of the web. Warren shows us just how fragile we are in a dangerous world. Mm-hmm. And he's referring to in chapter 1, the very first. In fact, we I think I read this to you on the phone about the ribbon of highway and the blacktop and how another writer might have said I was driving down the highway, but not Warren.
No,
he gave you and then again the simile and the use of the web as a real vehicle for I think having the reader, some of this honestly is emotional. I mean, mm-hmm. there are places mm-hmm. where the writing is so good mm-hmm. and it's so clear that it's beautiful.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
We leave chapter 4 and we leave Kass behind. So chapter 5, what's the main focus of 5 for us, Dr. Hyman.
Well, chapter 5, we jump right into the plot, right? So if before, as you said, we were in the theme, we're back in the plot in chapter 5. We are back in 1936. Whereas, chapter 1 through 3 jumps around in time, and then chapter 4 is kind of outside of time. We're back on the timeline in 1936 to 1937 here in chapter 5. And this is the chapter where Jack tries to get the dirt on Judge Irwin. And this is really a chapter about his methods at getting the truth. And actually, one question I have for readers is, he talks several times throughout the book about the difference between the truth and the facts. And I'm curious as to what people think about that. What do you make of that, either in this book itself, like what was the truth and what were the facts, or even in some sort of historical, political, or personal way, the difference between the truth and the facts? It's always something that's interesting to me.
And you mentioned Judge Irwin, who happens to be a friend who lives nearby, a friend of his mother's, and a friend of Jack's. In fact, Jack has been around him most of his life. That's who Judge Irwin is. So you can imagine if you had grown up and had an association with this man who was a very well-respected man. And there is a point where Governor Stark, because of George Irwin's tendency to favor someone else other than Willie Stark as a politician, says to Jack, go look in his closet, find the skeletons. In fact, I don't have it marked. There's a beautiful passage where Willie talks about when Jack says that there is no dirt. He's clean.
Right.
And it's a biblical quotation, is it not?
I'm not sure about that.
From Willie on basically everybody has dirt, everybody has skeletons.
Right.
Cast ye out of, but
Right.
I'm not going to
But
be able
essentially
to.
from the diaper to the grave, but he says it much more beautifully than that.
And this might be it. Man is conceived in sin and born in corruption, and he passeth from the stink of the ditty to the stench of the shroud. Thank you, Brooke Raby, who just happened to pull that up very quickly. That was beautiful. That was neat. So that's it. So in other words, he's saying, look, Jack, the governor's saying,
There's going to be something.
There's dirt on everybody.
Yes.
Every single one of us is a sinner. You go find it. And Jack's saying, no, Judge Irwin is clean as a pin.
Yes, and every image we've gotten of Judge Irwin up until this point, when I think of Judge Irwin, if I had to put in one word, is upright.
Yeah.
The way his posture, he refuses to sit down. When Willie comes to pay him a visit, he's upright.
Yeah.
And then it turns out there's dirt indeed.
Yeah.
Bad dirt.
So tell us, who is Mortimer Little Paul, Mortimer Little Paul, and without revealing too much, what does Jack sort of put together and through his investigative work as a journalist ends up.
Yeah, so what he realizes in chapter 5 is that the judge was indeed bribed by an electric company because they wanted a settlement. He was a judge on a case. They bribed him to rule for the power company. And then they took him on, he went to go work for the power company and kicked out this guy, Mortimer Little Paul, who ended up committing suicide over it. But not before he went to Governor Stanton. And raised the issue with Governor Stanton, and Governor Stanton ignored the bribe that was paid to Judge Irwin. And of course, Judge Irwin needed the bribe because he was broke. He was broke because despite trying to marry for money, it didn't work out, right? And so he needs the money for the mortgage on his plantation.
And Jack had a suspicion that at some point in his life he had been without financial stability, and thought that was a key. And before Little Paul committed suicide, though, he wrote everything down and he passed it along to his sister.
Right.
And just recall for us, if you will, I thought that was one of the most descriptive, telling pieces of discovering Little Paul's sister. And really, Jack was pretty tough on her to get this letter, and
Absolutely.
got it.
And I think Robert Penn Warren is at his best with sensory detail, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even need to look at the book and I know it's a fox-smelling lair, right? That she's in with the velvet and the candles, and he paints a picture. The same with Adam's apartment, which we get later, of the children's toys that you keep having to kick out of the way as you go up and down the stairs, and the smells, the descriptions are just extremely vivid.
So that's chapter 5, and before we get to chapter 6, I'll ask you to hold up Jonathan's book again. I want to just remind everyone that Jonathan Kulik has done such a masterful job of with the cooperation of the University Press of Kentucky and Kentucky Humanities, put together All the King's Men, a reader's companion. Jonathan will be here next month to talk about his own book. It is out now in bookstores and from the University Press of Kentucky. And quite honestly, it is a real compendium, a real guide and a support for me and for many others to read the novel and to refer to what Jonathan has done such a great job of doing. So that book is available. And by the way, that book is also going to be available to a lot of people that are going to be involved in our community discussions across the state of Kentucky, and some of our book discussions, 25 in all, that will be taking place in libraries and churches and bookstores and all kinds of places. So this is certainly something that you do such a good job of.
Well, I work with John, and I have read the book, and it. What I love is that it was not only helpful in understanding the book, but he really brings in voices throughout Kentucky now that help contextualize it as well. So
and the meaningful and the meaning of the book for those people and what they say. So in chapter 6. We're introduced to what the sort of the intrigue is building. There is I think Tiny Duffy is a minor character that you know in the very beginning of the book, but he sort of disappears, and then all of a sudden he comes back in chapter 6 and does what?
He schemes, right? Tiny Duffy is one of the best sort of characters, I think, in literature, of a schemer, right? And this, but before even we get to Tiny Duffy, I think we haven't also, I think, until this chapter, really gotten to know Tom Stark, who is the Willie Stark's son. And one of the first things, while Jack is off investigating the judge, he tells us what was going on while he was off getting the dirt on Judge Irwin. And what that was Tom Stark got really drunk and wrapped his new sports car around a tree, in the process injuring a young female companion. Tom's not hurt, and the girl's father takes a bribe, but Lucy Stark is furious, and that's going to become...
Lucy is Willie's
wife, yeah.
His estranged wife.
His estranged wife.
Were they ever formally divorced?
No, she lives away, right?
She moved back to the home place in the country.
And will they or will they not get divorced is going to be one of the questions for the later chapters. And then, while this is going on, Willie is becoming increasingly obsessed with this hospital project, and that's where Tiny Duffy comes in with his scheming. Tiny Duffy, of course, wants the contract and to scoop some of the money, of whoever gives the contract to off the top.
Patronage.
Yes, exactly. And so that's what Tiny Duffy wants. Meanwhile, what Willie wants is Adam Stanton, the surgeon, to come run the hospital. Adam Stanton
and Stanton's brother.
Yes, I know.
Friends of childhood friends of both Ann and Adam of Jack.
Yes. And it's interesting the ways in which all these characters are used, right? Some critics have said that, there aren't enough characters for this novel, that some characters are playing multiple roles, and we certainly see that in this chapter, right?
So tell us about Adam. Adam is... He is a surgeon, a brilliant, a pianist of some renown.
The child of Jack's youth. Yes, not married. The child of Jack's youth, which is another capital letters section, going back to their very earliest memories. Jack and Adam have been friends. And Adam is extremely concerned with not getting into the dirtiness of politics, right? Adam wants to do his surgery. Adam wants to save lives. He doesn't want to be mixed up in all the dirt that comes
Well, he's
off
also not of the same political ideology as Governor Stark.
Absolutely. Of course, Governor Stanton was of the opposite party. We're talking about old Southern aristocracy, and Willie is of more of the New Deal sort of Democrat.
Yeah. And so, but it comes to the point where Governor Stark wants to convince Adam to become director of the hospital. And of course, he goes to Jack, his childhood friend, to do that. So the first time when Jack confronts or speaks to Adam about this, Adam refuses. And the governor didn't like that at all and wouldn't take no for an answer.
Right.
So they both go see Adam. That is, Jack and Governor Stark go to see Adam. And that is a, again, I'll let you say a few words about dialogue, because of writers have told me, and you know, they're either, you can, well, I'll ask you this too. Can you teach writing dialogue writing? It's difficult, is it not?
Yeah, and you know, in nonfiction, I had a professor who called dialogue conversation's greatest hits. So, and I think for a novelist, that's going to be even more true. And so much, what I'm often telling students is that you should not have to use any dialogue tags. You should be able to get characterization purely from what people are saying to one another. And that's certainly true of the section that you're talking about, is that we can tell the characters not just from what they're saying, but how they're saying it, right? The back and forth.
Well, it's an excellent passage that goes on for a couple of pages, and the dialogue between Governor Stark and Adam, with Jack in the room just merely being observer, is pretty fascinating, and it's excellent. But the bottom line is that, well, they don't get along and they don't like each other, and that's evident. But Willie and Jack leave, and Adam still hasn't accepted the position at that point. And then what happens?
And then Jack tries to convince Anne to go see Adam. And in the process of having this discussion with Anne, realizes that Anne already knows about this plan.
Now, how did that occur?
Right. And at first, it just, you know, is one of those things that it doesn't quite register, but he knows is nagging in his mind. And of course, he later, you know, just thinks about this and thinks about this during this conversation in which he's asking Adam about, you know, Anne to go influence Adam, realizing Anne already knows about this, how he gets irritated. And in that irritation, he lets out to Anne that her father, and that Judge Irwin had participated in bribery, and that her father, the upstanding Governor Stanton, had actually looked the other way, which ends up having quite the crushing effect on Anne. Later, of course, in the chapter, we find out that Anne Stanton, of course, knows about this because Anne Stanton has become Willie Stark's mistress. And that last, like, I don't know if you're going to the last passage, but I hope so, because the last passage of chapter 6.
Well, it's in the closing moments of chapter 6. Under the flood of words and the savage finger and the snapping eyes, I jerked myself forward. This is Jack speaking. Dropped my feet to the floor with a crash and lunged up to stand before her. That's Sadie Burke, who reveals this to him. While the blood pounded in my head to make me dizzy, as it does when you rise suddenly, and little red flecks danced before me, and the words kept on. Then the words stopped on her question. Are you saying I began that I had been unable to pronounce the name of Anne Stanton? For the name itself had been quite clearly in my mind, as though spelled out on a billboard. But all at once the name stuck in my throat, and with surprise I discovered I could not say it. So I continued that but Sadie Burke was looking straight into my mind, at least I had that feeling, and quick as a boxer, she jabbed that name at me. Yeah, she the Stanton Girl, Anne Stanton.
Yeah. Wow. That I remember first read, you're certainly not seeing this coming at all. And of course, you know, and then the last part of this chapter, when we're left with Anne Stanton at the end of chapter 6. And first we get this physical description of her. White shadowy room behind her, wearing a pale blue, cool crisp linen dress, her bare white, small long arms hanging straight down against the pale blue, was Anne Stanton. Then I looked, and I'm skipping ahead a bit, but then I looked into her face. She met my gaze steadily. I did not say anything, for I did not need to. For looking at me, she slowly nodded. And to me, this is the kind of acknowledgement that, yes, Anne Stanton, innocent childhood, virginal Anne Stanton, is, yes, just as guilty as the rest, right? Just as fallible as all the rest of the human beings in this story, right?
And with that, we leave you hanging on edge because there's so much more to come, so much more drama, and it is drama, and how this reveal affects Jack and his life. and what goes on beyond that. But as we go out, Jessica, Kathy has this observation, thinking now about why Jack Burton's surname is an omen for Jack's life.
Yes, absolutely. That he has this burden of the past. He's burdened with the past. Of course, at the end, he loses burdens landing at a certain point. So we'll see if that burden of the past loses him, if he's able to escape that past that he still wants to escape.
So, final thoughts on chapters 4, 5, and 6, and a great conversation we've had tonight.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it so much. I think, again, to me, this is very much about the human fallibility and the ways in which we all, in some way, betray one another and can't escape the betrayals that have happened before us, and that we have to make amends for those, even if we did not cause them ourselves.
A good way to close. And we want to thank Dr. Heinemann for making the trip down from Northern Kentucky University tonight to join us on our Facebook Live All the King's Men discussion. We want to remind you that next month on August the 14th, we'll be here with Professor Jonathan Kullick, the author of A Reader's Companion, to talk about the final 7, 8, 9, and 10 chapters of All the King's Men. It's been a great pleasure to have you with us this month, and to have Richard Taylor with us during our first discussion. And we hope that you will all continue to watch and listen and read the novel along with us through this summer. So until next time, for All the King's Men and Robert Penn Warren's Facebook Live, I'm Bill Goodman, and this is Dr. Jessica Heinemann.